Ashley smiled as she welcomed another circle of well-dressed guests into the mansion, then casually pointed at me and said, "If you need anything tonight, just ask her. She's helping the staff." Not one person in that room knew I was her husband's mother. My own son Ryan stood beside her, heard every word, and never corrected her. I simply tightened my grip on the worn leather purse resting against my side. Inside was the old family ledger, the one book that held the truth about who had built every brick, every dollar, and every dream they were celebrating that night. None of them realized that before the evening was over, that forgotten book would speak louder than anyone in the room. If this story touches something in your heart, I'd love for you to stay with me until the end. Before we continue, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe if you enjoy emotional family stories, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. Most of all, I want to know this: if someone treated you like a stranger in your own family, what would you have done? The invitation came 3 weeks before the party. Though I hesitate to call it an invitation, it was more like a notice. Ryan called me on a Tuesday afternoon while I was sitting at my kitchen table, sorting coupons I no longer needed, but still kept out of habit. I had just made tea, the kind Michael used to like, with a slice of lemon, when my phone lit up with my son's name. For one foolish second, my heart lifted, the way a mother's heart always does when her child reaches out first. "Hi, Mom," he said, a little rushed. "Ashley and I are having a celebration at the house next month, the house he called it. Not our house, not the family house, not even the place Dad built. Just the house as if it had appeared on a hill one morning with marble floors, tall windows, and a circular driveway all on its own." "That sounds nice," I said. "What are you celebrating?" There was a pause, the kind that told me he was checking whether Ashley was within earshot. "The company's expansion. Ashley has been working on some investor relationships. It's a big step." I smiled softly, though he couldn't see it. "Your father would have been proud to see the company growing." Another pause. "Yes," Ryan said. "Anyway, Ashley wanted me to let you know you're welcome to come." Welcome to come. A mother hears every word her child says, but she also hears the words he chooses not to say. He did not say, "We want you there." He did not say it wouldn't feel right without you. He did not say, "Mom, this is your legacy too." Still, I told him I would be there. On the evening of the party, I arrived early, because that is what I had always done. In my years with Michael, I had learned that family celebrations never began when guests arrived. They began hours earlier in the kitchen, with nervous hands adjusting napkins, someone checking the oven, someone realizing there weren't enough forks, someone laughing over a mistake that would become a memory later. I brought a wrapped gift in soft silver paper. Inside was a framed photograph of the first Just Hardware and Supply storefront from 1979. Michael stood in front of it, with one hand on the door, smiling like a man who had more courage than money. I stood beside him in bell-bottom jeans, holding baby Ryan in my arms. Behind us, the painted sign was still crooked because Michael had insisted on hanging it himself. I thought Ryan might like it for his office. The mansion looked brighter than I remembered. Ashley had replaced the old porch lanterns with modern black fixtures and hired someone to wrap the front columns in white lights. Valet attendants in dark jackets stood near the driveway, guiding cars toward the curb. Through the tall windows, I could see movement inside servers in white shirts. A bartender arranging glasses, a florist carrying one last arrangement of cream roses and eucalyptus. When Michael and I first bought that land, it had nothing but weeds, mud, and an old oak tree near the back. We had planned to build a modest brick home there someday. But life moved, the business grew, and after years of working Saturdays and missing vacations, Michael built the house he said I deserved. Now I stood in front of it feeling like a visitor. Ashley opened the door before I could ring the bell. She wore a champagne-colored dress that shimmered whenever she moved. Her blonde hair swept back in a perfect twist. Her smile appeared quickly like a light switched on for company. "Jenny," she said. "Not Mom, not Mrs. Just Jenny, cool and polished." "You're early. I thought I might help before everyone arrived," I said. Her eyes dropped briefly to the gift in my hands. "Oh, that's sweet." She did not ask what it was. Behind her, the foyer had been transformed. A long table held crystal glasses of sparkling wine. A large arrangement of white flowers stood beneath the staircase. The old family photographs that used to line the hallway had been replaced by abstract gold-framed prints. I noticed at once that Michael's portrait was gone from the entry wall. I looked toward the empty space where it had hung for 14 years. Ashley followed my gaze. "We're trying to make the house feel more current," she said lightly. "Less old family museum." I swallowed the small ache that rose in my throat. "I see." Ryan came down the stairs adjusting his cufflinks. He looked handsome in a navy suit, taller than his father had been, with the same tired eyes Michael used to get during inventory season. For a moment, I saw my little boy, the one who used to run through the aisles of the store with a pencil behind his ear, pretending to take orders from customers. "Mom," he said. He kissed my cheek, but only quickly, as though someone might notice the affection and misunderstand it. "You look nice," I told him. "Thanks." Ashley picked the suit. Of course she had. I held out the gift. "I brought something for your office." Ryan reached for it, but Ashley stepped in first. "Let's put gifts in the study for now. Ryan has a lot of people to greet tonight." She took it from me and handed it to a passing server without even looking. "Study, please." The server nodded and disappeared down the hall with the photograph of my younger self, my late husband, and my baby boy. Ashley turned back to me with a sudden brightness. "Actually, Jenny, since you're here early, would you mind helping with a few little things the caterers are running behind?" I should have heard the warning in her voice, but I was still trying to be useful, still trying to belong. "Of course," I said. She led me into the dining room, where the long table had been dressed in ivory linen and gold chargers. Every place setting looked like it belonged in a magazine. Ashley handed me a stack of folded napkins. "These go at each setting angled to the left," she said. "Not straight. Angled." I nodded and began placing them carefully. Then she asked me to move the floral cards from one table to another. Then to carry small dessert plates from the pantry. Then to take a tray of miniature quiches to the warming station. Each request came with a smile if anyone was watching and a sharper edge if we were alone. "Not there, Jenny. Over there. Careful, those glasses are imported. No, the caterers have a system. Just follow what they're doing." I told myself she was stressed. I told myself parties made people particular. I told myself Ryan would notice soon and come stand beside me. But Ryan stayed in the living room with two men in suits laughing in the warm, easy way he rarely laughed with me anymore. By 6:30, guests began arriving in waves. Women in silk dresses, men with polished shoes and confident handshakes. People who smelled of expensive perfume, winter air, and money. Ashley floated among them as if she had been born for rooms like that. She introduced Ryan as the visionary behind Just Home Supply Group, though the company had never been called that until she changed the branding. She spoke of our growth, our future, and our family standard. No one mentioned Michael. No one mentioned the first store. No one mentioned the woman standing near the sideboard holding a tray because Ashley had just pressed it into her hands. I caught pieces of conversations as I moved quietly through the room. Ashley has done wonders with this place. She really elevated the family. Ryan is lucky. Some men inherit businesses and let them sit, but she clearly pushed him higher. One woman near the fireplace looked toward me and said, "Excuse me, could you point me to the powder room?" I opened my mouth to say I lived in this house for nearly 20 years, that I knew which floorboard creaked outside the laundry room, that I had chosen the wallpaper in the guest bath with my husband on a rainy Saturday. Instead, I simply smiled. "Down the hall, second door on the left." "Thank you," she said, already looking past me. That was when I first understood what Ashley had done. She had not merely ignored my place in the family. She had quietly erased it before the night even began. The guests did not know me because she had not told them. The house did not remember me because she had removed the photographs. The company did not carry my fingerprints because she had polished the story until only she and Ryan remained in it. For a moment, I stood alone near the dining room entrance and watched my son across the room. He saw me. I know he did. His eyes landed on the tray in my hands, then moved to Ashley, then back to the investor speaking beside him. He made a choice in that tiny silence. It was not loud, it was not dramatic, but some betrayals are quiet enough that only a mother hears them. I set the tray down. My fingers trembled, but my face stayed calm. I had spent too many years balancing books beside Michael to panic over a cruel room. I had survived unpaid bills, bank notices, broken furnaces, payroll shortages, and the kind of grief that makes even morning light feel heavy. Ashley could dress me down in front of strangers. Ryan could pretend not to see me. But hidden inside my purse beneath a handkerchief and a small bottle of peppermint drops was the old family ledger. And while everyone in that mansion was celebrating a version of history Ashley had invented, I was carrying the one thing that could prove the truth. Before there was a mansion on the hill, before there were catered parties and investors in tailored suits, before Ashley ever learned the just name, there was a narrow storefront on Maple Avenue with a cracked front window and a bell over the door that rang too loudly. That was where our family began. Michael and I opened Just Hardware and Supply in 1979 with $12,000, 2 secondhand shelves, 1 borrowed delivery truck, and more hope than sense. I was 21 years old, newly married and pregnant with Ryan. Michael was 24, broad-shouldered, stubborn, and convinced that a man could build a future with honest work, clean books, and the right woman beside him. He used to say I was the right woman. I used to laugh and tell him that if I was so right, he ought to let me sleep past 5 in the morning once in a while. But I never did. We opened that store before sunrise most days. Michael handled customers' lumber orders, plumbing supplies, and deliveries. I handled the register invoices, vendor calls, payroll taxes, inventory sheets, and the kind of math that could decide whether a family ate steak or soup that week. In the beginning, it was mostly soup. The first winter nearly broke us. A pipe burst in the back room and ruined 2 pallets of drywall we had bought on credit. A snowstorm shut down deliveries for 4 days. Then the furnace failed, and I remember sitting behind the counter in my coat, rubbing my hands together, while baby Ryan slept in a cardboard box lined with blankets beneath the desk. Michael felt ashamed of that box. I never did. That box was clean, warm, and close to me. That was all that mattered. Every night after closing, Michael swept the floors while I sat at the little metal desk in the office and opened the family ledger. It was a thick brown book with reinforced corners and lined pages. Michael bought it from an office supply store because he said computer records could be lost, receipts could fade, but handwriting carried memory. Put everything in there, Jenny, he told me. Every loan, every payment, every promise. One day this book will tell our family's true story. So I did. I wrote down the first loan from First County Bank. I wrote down the money Michael's uncle gave us and how quickly we paid it back. I wrote down the first month we could afford to hire someone part-time. I wrote down the day we finally made enough profit to buy Ryan a proper crib instead of letting him nap under my desk. And when things got bad, I wrote those things down too. I wrote down the year interest rates nearly swallowed us whole. I wrote down the supplier who threatened to cut us off unless we paid by Friday. I wrote down the amount I got for my wedding bracelet when I sold it to cover payroll. Michael cried when he found out. Not in front of anyone else. Only in our bedroom, sitting at the edge of the bed with that empty velvet box in his hand. "Jenny," he whispered, "I promised you I'd give you a good life." I sat beside him and took his hand. "You are giving me one. It just doesn't look fancy yet." That was the truth. Our life was not fancy, but it was ours. We built it piece by piece, nail by nail, receipt by receipt. Ryan grew up inside that store. His first steps were between aisle 3 and the paint counter. His first word after Mama was Bolt, though it sounded more like Bo. By the time he was 10, he could count change better than most adults. By 15, he knew which contractors paid late and which ones always brought donuts on Friday mornings. Michael was proud of him. Too proud sometimes. "That boy will run this place one day," he would say. I would look up from the ledger and smile. Only if he learns that running a business means more than standing behind a desk. Ryan did learn for a while. He worked summers loading bags of concrete into pickup trucks. He delivered invoices after school. He listened when Michael taught him how to shake a man's hand and look him in the eye. And when Ryan went to college for business, Michael and I both cried in the parking lot after dropping him off. We paid for that college with profits from the store, a second mortgage, and 2 years without a vacation. I never told Ryan that part. Mothers often hide the weight of their sacrifices because we don't want our children to feel guilty for the life we wanted them to have. Maybe that was my mistake. Maybe silence can become dangerous when the wrong people use it to rewrite history. When Ryan came back after graduation, he was sharper, more polished, full of ideas about growth branding, expansion, and market position. Michael admired his energy. I admired it too, though sometimes I missed the boy who used to sit on a stack of paint buckets and eat peanut butter crackers while telling me about school. We let him take on more responsibility, slowly at first, then more quickly when Michael's health began to fail. My husband never liked doctors. He said they found problems the way mechanics found extra repairs. But I knew something was wrong long before he admitted it. He tired easily. He rubbed his chest when he thought I wasn't looking. He stopped carrying heavy boxes, then pretended it was because he wanted younger men to feel useful. One September morning, Michael kissed me before leaving for the warehouse, told me he loved me, and collapsed beside the loading dock less than an hour later. A heart attack. That was what they called it. Such small words for the moment that split my life into before and after. At the funeral, Ryan held my hand so tightly I thought he might break it. He cried into my shoulder and promised me he would protect everything his father built. "I won't let him down, Mom," he said. I believed him. For the first year he tried. He came to Sunday dinners. He asked my advice. He kept Michael's office mostly unchanged. He even asked me to continue reviewing the books, though he had hired a young accountant by then. Then Ashley appeared. She was beautiful in a way that made rooms rearrange themselves around her. Blonde hair, bright smile, careful manners, and eyes that measured everything. Ryan met her at a charity luncheon downtown, and within 6 months he was bringing her to dinner. She complimented my cooking, praised the house, asked polite questions about Michael, and looked around my living room as if she were already deciding what needed replacing. At first I told myself I was being unfair. A mother can be protective. A widow can be sensitive. A woman who has lost her husband can mistake change for threat. So I welcomed Ashley. I invited her to Thanksgiving. I gave her Michael's mother's recipe for pecan pie. I helped Ryan choose the ring. I even told him she had strong taste, which was my gentlest way of saying she was the kind of woman who never entered a room without wanting to control it. After the wedding, the changes came quickly. Ashley convinced Ryan to renovate the house for entertaining. Then she convinced him the company needed a more upscale image. Just Hardware and Supply became Just Home Supply Group. The old logo Michael had drawn on graph paper disappeared. The sign at the original Maple Avenue store was replaced with something sleek and gray. Ryan called it modernization. I tried to be proud, but then came the little comments. Jenny customers don't really respond to old-fashioned stories anymore. Ryan needs to look forward, not backward. Your generation was very hard-working, of course, but business is different now. Your generation. As if I were a chapter that had already ended. The first time Ashley suggested I stop coming into the office, Ryan looked embarrassed, but said nothing. The second time he told me maybe I deserved rest. By the third time, my key card no longer worked at the main office, and the receptionist looked uncomfortable when I tried to enter. That hurt more than I admitted. Still, I stayed quiet. I had the house, I had my memories, I had Grace, who still ran into my arms when she saw me. I had the old family ledger in a cedar chest at the foot of my bed, wrapped in a faded blue scarf. And I had something Ashley never understood. Paper remembers, numbers remember, signatures remember. Long before Ashley wore champagne silk and called me staff in front of strangers, Michael and I had written the truth down in black ink. We had documented every dollar, every deed, every loan, every transfer, every agreement made when the company was still a dream with dust on the floor. Ashley thought I was just an old woman with soft hands and sentimental stories. But my hands had signed the guarantees that kept the business alive. My name still sat on papers Ryan had not bothered to read closely. My sacrifices were not just memories, they were records, and records, unlike people, do not get intimidated by pretty lies. By 7 o'clock, the mansion was full. The sound of crystal glasses clinking together mixed with soft jazz drifting through the living room. Expensive perfume floated through the air, blending with the aroma of roasted beef, fresh herbs, and warm bread. Everywhere I looked, people were smiling, introducing themselves, exchanging business cards, and complimenting Ashley on what they called a flawless evening. She accepted every compliment as though she had personally created everything they admired. This house is stunning. Thank you. The company has grown so much. We've worked incredibly hard. You've built something remarkable. We certainly have. Each time she said, we, I noticed she never looked toward Ryan. She certainly never looked toward me. I stood near the dining room entrance, holding a silver tray that one of the caterers had quietly handed me after Ashley nodded in my direction. I hadn't intended to keep helping. Somewhere between arranging dessert forks and carrying another tray of champagne flutes, I realized Ashley had slowly folded me into the evening service without ever asking whether I wanted to participate. The professional staff assumed I belonged with them. The guests assumed the same, and Ashley never corrected either group. One young waiter smiled kindly as he passed me. "You're doing great. First event with this company." I almost laughed. "No," I answered softly. "In a way, I've been here longer than anyone." He smiled politely, assuming I was making a joke before hurrying away. I watched him disappear into the crowd. He wasn't rude. He simply didn't know. None of them did. Near the fireplace, Ryan was speaking with Richard Hayes, the investor Ashley had spent months trying to impress. Richard looked to be in his late 60s, wearing a charcoal suit and carrying himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had negotiated million-dollar contracts for decades. Ashley stood beside them, laughing at precisely the right moments. Every movement she made seemed rehearsed. She lightly touched Ryan's arm whenever someone praised him. She tilted her head modestly whenever someone praised her. She knew exactly how to make herself appear gracious. Across the room, I noticed another familiar face, Linda Morrison. Linda and I had met more than 30 years earlier through a local charity board. She had known Michael almost as long as I had. We hadn't seen each other often in recent years, but every Christmas we exchanged handwritten cards. She spotted me almost immediately. For a second, her smile widened. Then she looked at the tray in my hands. Her expression changed. Confusion, then disbelief. She excused herself from the conversation she was having and walked toward me. "Jenny," I smiled warmly. "Hello, Linda." She glanced at the tray. "What on earth are you doing?" Before I could answer, Ashley appeared beside us. "Oh, you've met." Linda looked between us. "Of course I've met Jenny." Ashley laughed lightly. "She's been wonderful helping us tonight." Helping us. Not introducing me, not saying I was family, not saying I was Ryan's mother, just helping us. Linda frowned. "I know she's helping," she said carefully. "But—" Ashley interrupted before she could finish. "We've all been pitching in tonight." Then she gently touched Linda's elbow. "Richard wanted to ask you about the hospital foundation. Come, I'll introduce you." Linda looked back at me one more time. There was a question in her eyes. I answered it with the smallest shake of my head. "Not yet." She reluctantly followed Ashley. As they walked away, I heard Linda say quietly, "I thought—" The rest disappeared into the music. I released a slow breath. Ashley wasn't simply avoiding the truth. She was managing it. Every conversation, every introduction, every impression. She was directing the entire evening like a stage performance, making certain no one had enough information to ask the right questions. I admired the strategy. I disliked the purpose. Another guest approached me. "Could you take our picture?" He handed me his phone without hesitation. I smiled. "Of course." His wife stood beside him beneath the grand staircase. "Make sure you get the chandelier," she said. "It's gorgeous." I stepped backward until they fit perfectly into the frame. "Perfect," I said, after taking several photos. "Thank you." They walked away without asking my name, without realizing whose staircase they were standing beneath. I found myself looking up toward the second floor. Years ago, Michael had insisted on widening that staircase. "We'll have grandchildren running down these steps one day," he'd said. He'd been right. Grace had learned to slide down that polished banister, despite my constant warnings. I could still hear her childish laughter echoing through the house. That memory made what happened next hurt even more. Ashley climbed halfway up those same stairs and gently tapped a spoon against her champagne glass. The room gradually quieted. Everyone turned toward her. She smiled with effortless confidence. "I'd like to thank all of you for joining us tonight." Applause followed. "Our family has entered an exciting new chapter." More applause. Ryan and I couldn't have done this without the support of so many wonderful people. She gestured toward several investors. Richard smiled politely. Ashley continued, "This evening is about celebrating growth, vision, and the future." The guests nodded. Then someone near the back asked, "Who handled everything tonight?" "The service has been excellent." Ashley laughed. "Oh, we've had wonderful help." She slowly turned. Then she pointed directly at me. "There she is." Every eye in the room followed her finger. "Jenny has been absolutely wonderful tonight." I froze. Ashley smiled wider. "She's helped coordinate everything with the staff." A few guests clapped politely. One woman called across the room, "You've done an amazing job." Another added, "The service has been outstanding." Ashley wasn't finished. She looked directly at me. "Jenny, would you mind bringing over another tray of champagne before dinner?" For several long seconds, no one spoke. Dozens of strangers looked at me with warm appreciation. They genuinely believed I worked there, because Ashley had made sure they believed it. My eyes slowly drifted toward Ryan. He knew. He knew exactly what had just happened. He knew every single person in that room believed his own mother was part of the catering staff. He could have corrected it with one sentence. One. "This is my mother." That was all it would have taken. Instead, he lowered his eyes, just for a moment. Then he forced a weak smile and took another sip of his drink. It was the smallest act of cowardice I had ever witnessed, yet somehow it hurt more than if he had shouted at me, because silence carries its own kind of betrayal. Around me, conversations resumed. People smiled. Music began playing again. Someone asked where the restroom was. Someone complimented the floral arrangements. Someone thanked me for the champagne. I answered every question with quiet politeness. Inside, something had changed. Not broken, changed. For years, I had convinced myself that patience could repair anything, that enough love could heal any family wound, that if I remained kind long enough, eventually people would remember everything Michael and I had sacrificed. Standing there among strangers in my own home, I finally understood something. Some people mistake kindness for weakness. Some people believe silence means surrender. Ashley certainly did. Ryan probably did too. Neither of them knew what rested inside the worn leather purse hanging from my shoulder. The family ledger, the only witness left that had never forgotten who truly built the Just family. I gently rested one hand on the purse. For the first time that evening, I wasn't thinking about enduring the humiliation. I was thinking about when it should end. I slipped away from the laughter before anyone noticed I was gone. The library sat at the far end of the first floor, tucked behind a pair of walnut doors that Michael had insisted on installing years ago. "Every home needs one quiet room," he used to say, "someplace where people tell the truth, even if it's only to themselves." The party's music faded as I stepped inside. The room smelled exactly as I remembered, aged leather cedar shelves and the faint scent of old paper. Unlike the foyer, Ashley had done very little to change this room. She had replaced the curtains and added a modern rug, but the built-in bookcases remained, as did Michael's oak desk beneath the tall window overlooking the backyard. I closed the door softly behind me. For the first time that evening, I allowed myself to breathe. I placed my purse on the desk and rested both hands on its worn leather. My fingers lingered on the clasp for several seconds. "So," I whispered to the empty room, "I suppose it's time." Inside, beneath a folded handkerchief and a small tin of peppermint candies, lay the family ledger. The leather cover was cracked from decades of use. The corners had softened with age, and the gold lettering had nearly disappeared. To anyone else, it looked like an ordinary bookkeeping journal that belonged in an antique store. To me, it was the history of an entire family. I carefully opened the first page. My own handwriting greeted me. January 8th, 1979. Business account opened. Opening balance, $12,000. Michael had written one sentence beneath my entry in his larger handwriting. "Every fortune begins as someone's impossible dream." A tear slipped down my cheek before I could stop it. I smiled through it. "You always did know how to encourage me." I slowly turned another page. Every line brought back another memory. vendor payments, equipment purchases, payroll records, interest statements, insurance renewals, repairs, tax filings. Each page represented another season of our lives. People often imagine that successful businesses are built by dramatic moments. One brilliant decision, one lucky opportunity, one giant contract. They aren't. They're built by thousands of ordinary decisions. Choosing to pay employees before paying yourself, working Saturdays instead of taking vacations, replacing broken equipment instead of buying new furniture, keeping promises when breaking them would have been easier. The ledger remembered every one of those choices. I stopped at a page dated April 18th, 1987. A folded document remained tucked inside. I carefully unfolded it. It was the original collateral agreement from First County Bank. Michael had signed it. So had I. But something else caught my attention. The guarantee securing that loan rested entirely under my personal assets. Not Michael's. Mine. Back then, Michael's credit history wasn't strong enough to satisfy the bank. My father had left me a small inheritance years earlier, along with the title to a parcel of land outside town. Without telling many people, I pledged everything. If the business failed, I would have lost it all. I never regretted the decision. Michael hadn't either. But suddenly I realized something. Ashley had never known. She knew the polished version of our success. She didn't know what it had cost. I continued turning pages. Each section contained more than numbers. There were handwritten notes. Jenny sold bracelet today to cover payroll. Paid back Uncle Frank in full. Ryan's college tuition worth every penny. Purchased adjoining warehouse. Mortgage released. There was no boasting, no self-congratulation, only facts. Facts that no one had cared to ask about. Then I reached the section that Thomas Caldwell had instructed us to keep separate from the operating records. Property ownership, corporate restructuring, trust agreements. I adjusted my glasses and leaned closer. Several original documents had been copied into the ledger decades earlier for safekeeping. One page listed every transfer of ownership since the company was founded. Another detailed the restructuring after Michael's death. Then I found the page that made me sit perfectly still. The heading read, Protective Ownership Provision. I remembered the conversation immediately. Michael had insisted on meeting Thomas one rainy afternoon after his first hospitalization. "I don't want Jenny left vulnerable if something ever happens to me," he'd said. Thomas had drafted several legal protections. At the time, I barely paid attention. I trusted Michael completely. Now I carefully reread every sentence. The family residence, majority voting authority over specific real estate assets, final approval for any sale involving original family properties, all protected, subject to one condition, as long as I remained living. I blinked twice, then read it again. Ashley couldn't legally authorize the sale of the mansion without my approval. Neither could Ryan. Not because I owned everything outright, but because Michael had insisted that the original family assets could never be transferred without my written consent. I remembered teasing him when he first explained it. "Why all these precautions?" He had smiled. "Because businesses survive hard times." He paused before adding quietly, "Families don't always." At the time, I thought he was being overly cautious. Now his words echoed through the silent library with startling clarity. Families don't always. A knock sounded lightly against the door. I closed the ledger halfway. "Come in." The door opened slowly. Thomas Caldwell stepped inside. His silver hair had grown thinner over the years, but his posture remained straight, and his eyes were as observant as ever. For a brief moment, neither of us spoke. Then he smiled gently. "I thought I'd find you here." "So did I admitted. He looked toward the closed ledger. "You brought it." "I never leave it behind." Thomas nodded approvingly. "Michael would be glad." He walked over and sat in the chair opposite mine. "I owe you an apology." "For what?" "I should have visited more often after Michael passed. I assumed Ryan understood the structure his father created." "So did I." Thomas folded his hands together. "It appears we were both mistaken." Silence settled between us. Finally, I asked the question that had been growing in my mind all evening. "Did you know Ashley has been telling people the company belongs entirely to them?" I suspected. "And the expansion." He exhaled slowly. I reviewed preliminary paperwork several months ago. My stomach tightened. What paperwork? A proposed transaction involving a minority ownership interest. I stared at him. They're trying to sell part of the company. They're trying to attract outside investment. Without telling me. Thomas gave a single nod. I declined to finalize anything. Why? Because your signature was missing. The room suddenly felt very quiet. Thomas continued. They assumed Ryan's authority was sufficient. It wasn't. No. He reached toward the ledger, but stopped short of touching it. Everything necessary to prove that is sitting in front of you. I looked down at the familiar pages. For decades, I had thought of the ledger as a family keepsake, a memory book, a reminder of Michael. Now I understood something entirely different. It wasn't merely a record of the past, it was evidence. Evidence of promises made. Evidence of sacrifices given. Evidence of ownership that could not simply be rewritten because someone preferred a more convenient story. Thomas looked at me carefully. What are you going to do, Jenny? I closed the ledger gently. Outside the library, applause erupted as Ashley apparently began another speech. The sound barely reached us through the heavy doors. I rested my hand on the worn leather cover. For years I had believed preserving peace meant staying silent. Tonight had taught me that silence can become permission. Ashley believed she had already won. Ryan believed avoiding conflict would somehow protect everyone. Neither of them realized the truth was no longer buried in old memories. It was documented, signed, dated, and sitting on the desk directly in front of me. I met Thomas's eyes. I'm not going to embarrass anyone. He nodded quietly. I didn't think you would. But, I continued, my voice steadier than it had been all evening, I'm also not going to let them erase Michael's life, or mine. For the first time since arriving at the party, I felt completely calm. The humiliation Ashley had planned for me was over. She simply didn't know it yet. Thomas remained seated across from me, his hands folded neatly over the handle of his cane. Outside the library, laughter rolled through the mansion again, followed by another burst of applause. It sounded as though two completely different worlds existed under the same roof. One was celebrating a polished version of the Just Family story. The other still remembered how that story had actually been written. Thomas broke the silence first. There is something else you need to know. His voice was calm, but I had known him long enough to recognize when he was choosing his words carefully. What is it? Ashley didn't begin asking questions about the company's ownership a few weeks ago. I frowned. How long? Almost a year. The answer settled heavily in my chest. A year? He nodded. At first, her questions seemed innocent enough. She wanted copies of the incorporation documents. Then she asked about voting rights. Later, she became interested in the original property deeds. I slowly looked back down at the ledger. I never knew. I don't believe Ryan knew everything either. That surprised me. You think she kept things from him? I think she revealed only what supported her plans. Thomas leaned forward slightly. She asked me several times whether the original ownership provisions were still enforceable. And what did you tell her? The truth. He gave a faint smile. I told her legal documents don't expire simply because they're inconvenient. I couldn't help smiling back. That sounds like you. It also irritated her. I wasn't surprised. Ashley had always believed persistence could solve every problem. If one person said no, she found another. If one door closed, she looked for a window. That determination had probably helped her succeed in business. It had also convinced her that every obstacle eventually gave way. Except some obstacles weren't people. Some were contracts. Some were promises. Some were written in permanent ink. Thomas reached into his briefcase and removed a thin manila folder. I brought these tonight because I had a feeling something unusual might happen. Inside were photocopies of documents I hadn't seen in years. The trust agreement. The original operating agreement. The first corporate bylaws Michael and I had signed at our kitchen table. Then Thomas placed one final document on top. I recognized it immediately. The Property Protection Amendment. Michael had insisted on adding it after a neighboring family lost their company during an ugly inheritance dispute. They fought for 6 years, he told me afterward. The business survived. He paused before adding quietly, the family didn't. That conversation came rushing back so clearly I could almost hear his voice. I don't ever want our son choosing between his wife and his mother because of money. At the time, I laughed. Ryan would never let that happen. Michael had smiled sadly. I hope you're right. I closed my eyes. Oh, Michael. Thomas watched me without speaking. After a moment, I asked the question that had been growing in my mind. If Ashley couldn't move forward without my signature, he nodded. Then why hold this party? To impress investors. And perhaps to build momentum. I frowned. What do you mean? If enough investors committed publicly, she may have hoped you'd feel pressured to cooperate afterward. That sounded exactly like Ashley. She never liked direct confrontation. She preferred situations where everyone else expected a particular outcome. Saying no became difficult when saying yes appeared to make everyone happy. It wasn't force. It was pressure. A quieter form of control. I remembered the papers she had asked me to sign over the past year. Tax updates, insurance revisions, routine company paperwork. She always explained them quickly. Nothing important. Just standard forms. You don't need to read every page. Fortunately, I had developed one habit during 40 years of bookkeeping. I never signed anything I hadn't read. Sometimes that annoyed Ashley. Now I understood why. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. Before either of us answered, the door opened slightly. It was Grace. My 15-year-old granddaughter peeked inside. There you are. Her face brightened the moment she saw me. There you are, Grandma. Unlike everyone else in the house, Grace had never shortened my place in the family. Never Jenny, always Grandma. She hurried across the room and wrapped her arms around me. You disappeared. I needed a little quiet. She pulled back and studied my face. Are you okay? Teenagers often notice what adults pretend not to see. I smiled gently. I'm better now. She wasn't convinced. Her eyes drifted toward Thomas. Hi, Mr. Caldwell. Hello, Grace. She looked back at me. I've been looking everywhere. Why, Dad wanted to know where you went. That surprised me. He did? She nodded. But, she hesitated. I don't think Mom was very happy you left. Thomas and I exchanged a brief glance. Interesting. Grace lowered her voice. I heard Mom telling Dad that investors keep asking who you are. I remained silent. Grace continued. Some of them thought you were part of the catering company. The words hurt, not because I hadn't already lived them, because hearing them repeated by my granddaughter somehow made them more real. Grace frowned. I told one lady you're my grandmother. My heart tightened. What did she say? She looked confused. Grace shrugged. She said she thought you worked here. I reached up and gently brushed a strand of hair behind Grace's ear. You did the right thing. She looked directly into my eyes. Grandma. Yes. Why didn't Dad tell everyone? There it was, the question I had been asking myself all evening. Only somehow it sounded much more painful coming from a 15-year-old girl. I searched for an answer gentle enough for her. I chose my words carefully. I think sometimes adults become so afraid of uncomfortable moments that they make even bigger mistakes trying to avoid them. Grace nodded slowly. I don't want to grow up like that. Neither did I. You won't. How do you know? Because you asked the question. Thomas smiled quietly. Grace noticed the old ledger resting on the desk. I remember that book. You do? You used to let me turn the pages when I was little. I laughed softly. You always wanted to find your birthday. I did. She smiled. You showed me where Grandpa wrote that I was born. I opened the ledger and turned carefully toward the later pages. There it was, May 14th. Grace Elizabeth, just born at 8:42 a.m. Underneath, Michael had written, our family's greatest investment yet. Grace smiled as she read it. I forgot Grandpa wrote things like that. He wrote what mattered. She looked thoughtfully at the book. So this really has our whole family inside it. In many ways. Her fingers lightly touched the edge of one page. Then nobody should ever throw it away. Thomas cleared his throat. They won't. His tone carried more certainty than either of us missed. Grace glanced toward the hallway. I should go back. She hugged me again. I love you, Grandma. I love you too. After she left, silence returned. Thomas looked toward the closed door. She has Michael's heart. She does. And perhaps your courage. I smiled faintly. I hope she never needs it. Outside, music shifted to something slower. Dinner would begin soon, which meant speeches, introductions, toasts. Ashley would almost certainly stand before everyone again. Thomas slowly stood. So, have you decided? I looked once more at the family ledger. For years I had protected it because it reminded me of Michael. Tonight I realized I was protecting something even larger. The truth. Not for revenge, not to humiliate Ashley, not even to prove I was right, but because families cannot heal from lies they refuse to acknowledge. I carefully closed the worn leather cover. The sound echoed softly through the quiet library. Then I placed the ledger back inside my purse. Yes, I said. Thomas studied me. What are you going to do? I straightened my jacket and picked up my purse. I'm going back to the party. He smiled. And I looked toward the library doors, where the distant sound of Ashley's voice floated down the hallway. I'm going to give Ashley every opportunity to tell the truth herself. Thomas raised one eyebrow. And if she doesn't? I rested one hand over the purse. The weight of the family ledger felt different now. Not heavy, steady. Then, I said quietly, the ledger will. Thomas opened the library door for me, but before either of us stepped into the hallway, he placed a gentle hand on my arm. One last piece of advice. I looked at him. When the moment comes, don't speak out of anger. I won't. Speak out of truth. I smiled faintly. Michael always said the truth doesn't need a raised voice. Thomas nodded. He learned that from you. For the first time all evening, I felt something I hadn't expected. Peace. Not because the evening had improved. It hadn't. Ashley was still controlling the narrative. Ryan was still avoiding my eyes. The guests still believed a carefully edited version of our family's history, but I was no longer afraid of any of it. Truth has a strange way of calming the person who carries it. We walked back into the hallway. The music had stopped. Servers were lighting candles down the center of the enormous dining table, while guests slowly made their way toward their assigned seats. Ashley stood near the entrance with a tablet in one hand, directing everyone with effortless confidence. Oh, Richard, we'd love to have you here. Linda, you're beside the mayor. Mr. and Mrs. Fletcher this way. Everything had been choreographed. Everything except me. The moment Ashley noticed me, her smile tightened for the briefest second before returning. There you are, Jenny. As if nothing had happened, as if I had merely wandered off. We're almost ready for dinner, I smiled politely. I can see that. She glanced toward Thomas. Oh, Mr. Caldwell, thank you for keeping Jenny company. Thomas answered before I could. My pleasure. His voice carried exactly the right amount of politeness. No more, no less. Ashley didn't notice. Or perhaps she did and simply chose to ignore it. She stepped closer to me and lowered her voice enough that only I could hear. I could really use one more favor. There it was, another favor. What do you need? The dessert service is running a little behind. She pointed toward the kitchen. Could you bring the coffee trays out after dinner? I studied her face. There wasn't an ounce of embarrassment, no hesitation. She genuinely expected me to continue acting as unpaid staff. Not because she hated me, because somewhere along the way she had convinced herself that this was my place. I answered calmly, I'm afraid I won't be doing that. Her smile barely moved. I'm sorry. I won't be serving coffee tonight. A flicker of irritation crossed her eyes. It'll only take a few minutes. I'm sure your catering team can manage. Her voice became softer. Jenny, please don't make this difficult. Difficult. Interesting choice of words. For years, I had been the one making things easy. Easy to overlook, easy to interrupt, easy to leave out of conversations, easy to underestimate. Tonight, I simply replied no. Ashley looked genuinely surprised. Perhaps it was the first time I had ever refused her. Before she could respond, Richard Hayes approached us carrying a glass of sparkling water. "There you are," he said warmly. "I've been hoping to meet you properly." Ashley immediately recovered her polished smile. "Oh, Richard, this is—" He extended his hand toward me. "I'm Richard Hayes." I shook it. "Jenny Just. Mrs. Just." "Yes." He looked briefly between Ashley and me. "I've heard wonderful things about this family." Ashley laughed lightly. "We've all worked very hard." Richard nodded thoughtfully. "I'm sure." Then he turned back to me. "Were you involved with the business as well?" Ashley answered before I could. Jenny mostly preferred staying behind the scenes. Behind the scenes. That wasn't entirely false. I had spent decades behind the bookkeeping desk, behind payroll, behind tax filings, behind supplier negotiations, behind loan applications, behind every crisis that threatened to close our doors. But Ashley made it sound like I had simply preferred privacy. Richard smiled politely. "Someone told me you've been helping the staff tonight." There was no accusation in his voice, only curiosity. Ashley answered immediately. "Jenny likes keeping busy." Thomas had quietly joined us by then. He looked directly at Richard. "Mrs. Just has indeed kept busy." His tone remained calm. "For nearly 50 years. Richard glanced at him with interest. "Oh." Thomas smiled slightly. "Long before any of us were invited to parties in this house." Ashley quickly changed the subject. "Richard, dinner is ready." He nodded, but looked back at me one last time. "I hope we'll have a chance to speak later." "I'd like that." As he walked away, Ashley turned toward Thomas. "I'm not sure I understand." "I'm sure you will." His answer was perfectly courteous. Ashley frowned almost imperceptibly. Then another guest approached, pulling her away before she could ask more questions. Thomas leaned closer. "People are beginning to notice." "I can feel it." "Good." We entered the dining room together. The table looked magnificent. Crystal chandeliers reflected against polished silver. Tall white candles flickered between arrangements of roses. Each place card had been handwritten in elegant gold ink. At the head of the table sat Ryan. Ashley occupied the chair beside him. The remaining seats had been carefully arranged around investors, local officials, charity board members, and longtime business partners. I searched quietly for my place card. It wasn't near Ryan. It wasn't beside Grace. It wasn't even among the family seats. Finally, I found it, near the far end of the table, between two guests I had never met, beside one of the catering stations, almost hidden behind a floral arrangement. I couldn't help smiling. Ashley had planned every detail. Distance tells its own story. Grace noticed me from across the room. "Grandma!" She waved enthusiastically. "Dad, Grandma's all the way down there." Ryan looked toward my seat. For a brief moment, something resembling guilt crossed his face. He started to stand. Ashley gently touched his arm beneath the table. "It's already arranged." He slowly sat back down. Again. Silence. Again. He chose the easier path. Grace looked confused. "Why can't Grandma sit with us?" Ashley answered smoothly. "This arrangement works best for conversation." Grace didn't look convinced. Neither did Linda Morrison. She had been seated only 3 places away from me. As she settled into her chair, she leaned over slightly. "Jenny?" "Yes." "I've known you too long to pretend everything is normal tonight." I smiled gently. "It isn't." She studied my face. "Are you going to tell them?" I looked down at my purse resting beside my chair. Inside, the family ledger felt almost alive. "I wasn't planning to." Linda raised an eyebrow. I wanted tonight to be about Ryan. And now, I slowly lifted my eyes toward the head of the table. Ashley was laughing. Ryan was smiling politely. Neither of them had looked my way once since we entered the room. I answered quietly, "Now I think tonight needs to be about the truth." Linda followed my gaze. After a long pause, she simply nodded. "I'll be listening." Across the room, Ashley stood once more and gently tapped her glass. The conversations faded. Every face turned toward her. She lifted her champagne flute with complete confidence. "My friends," she began warmly, "before dinner, I'd like to share a few words about the incredible journey that brought our family to this moment." I rested one hand on my purse beneath the table. Ashley believed she was about to tell everyone the story of the Just family. She had no idea that within a few minutes, the only version anyone would remember would be the one written decades earlier in faded ink inside a worn leather ledger. Ashley lifted her champagne flute just high enough for the crystal to catch the light from the chandelier. "My friends," she began with effortless confidence, "thank you for being here tonight. This evening is more than a celebration. It's the beginning of an exciting new chapter for our family and our company." Applause rippled around the room. I remained still. Ashley had always known how to command a room. She spoke slowly, smiled at exactly the right moments, and made every sentence sound rehearsed without feeling artificial. "When Ryan and I began leading the company," she continued, "we knew we wanted to honor its history while building something even greater." Honor its history. The words almost made me smile. She spoke of history as though she were its author. "Our vision has transformed a small local business into a regional brand ready for national expansion." Another round of applause followed. Richard Hayes nodded thoughtfully. Several investors exchanged approving glances. Ashley continued describing new distribution centers, future partnerships, and ambitious growth plans. She thanked employees, consultants, architects, marketing firms, and financial advisors. She thanked everyone, except the two people who had created the business she was celebrating, Michael and me. Not once did she speak our names. I noticed Grace shifting uncomfortably in her chair. She looked from Ashley to me and back again. Even at 15, she understood that something important was missing. Ashley smiled warmly toward Ryan. "My husband has been the heart of this company." Ryan looked surprised by the compliment. He smiled back, though I recognized the uncertainty behind it. "I couldn't have done any of this without him." Then she turned toward the guests. "Everything you see today exists because we dared to dream bigger." Everything. The word echoed in my mind. Everything. The first store, the warehouse, the delivery trucks, the land beneath the mansion, the reputation that allowed investors to trust the Just name, everything. It all existed long before Ashley entered our lives. She simply spoke as though history had begun the day she arrived. Thomas quietly folded his napkin beside me. Without looking in my direction, he whispered, "She's almost there." I knew exactly what he meant. Ashley had one final announcement, the one she believed would secure Richard Hayes' investment. She raised her glass again. "I'm thrilled to share that Just Home Supply Group is preparing for its largest expansion in company history." Excited murmurs spread through the room. "Our family has agreed to open a new investment partnership that will allow us to bring our values to communities across the Midwest." "My family has agreed." "Not exactly," Ashley continued. "We're entering this next chapter with complete unity." Complete unity. Thomas slowly removed his glasses. I noticed Linda Morrison watching Ashley with growing concern. Richard Hayes leaned forward with genuine interest. Ashley smiled brightly. "And after dinner we'll be signing the preliminary commitment documents." There it was, the moment Thomas had warned me about, public pressure. If investors believed every family member supported the expansion, saying no afterward would make me appear unreasonable. Ashley wasn't asking for my approval tonight. She was trying to make my approval seem inevitable. I looked toward Ryan. He wasn't smiling anymore. Instead, he stared down at his plate. His fingers tightened around the stem of his water glass. He knew, maybe not every legal detail, but enough to understand that something Ashley had just said wasn't true. Still, he remained silent. Ashley lifted a leather portfolio from beside her chair. "This folder represents the future of our family." She rested her hand proudly on it. "The final signatures are simply a formality." Thomas quietly looked toward me. Not yet. His expression said everything. "Wait." Ashley invited Richard Hayes to stand. Richard smiled politely and rose from his chair. "Ladies and gentlemen," Ashley said, "Mr. Hayes has believed in our vision from the very beginning." Richard nodded modestly. "I'm impressed by what you've accomplished." Ashley beamed. "Thank you. I've reviewed the financial summaries. We're very proud of them. And I look forward to reviewing the final ownership documents." Ashley answered without hesitation. "They're all in order." Thomas lowered his eyes. I noticed the corner of his mouth tighten ever so slightly. Richard continued, "I've always believed that successful investments begin with trustworthy families." "So do we," Ashley replied. Then came the sentence that changed everything. "I can assure you there are no outstanding ownership questions whatsoever." Thomas slowly placed his napkin on the table. Across the room, Linda inhaled sharply. Grace looked confused. Ryan closed his eyes for just a second. Ashley smiled confidently. "The entire family is completely united." Silence settled over me. Not an uncomfortable silence, a peaceful one. Because in that instant I realized something important. Ashley had just crossed a line she couldn't uncross. She hadn't merely embarrassed me anymore. She had made a factual statement that I knew wasn't true. And unlike opinions, facts can be verified. Richard smiled. "That's wonderful to hear." Ashley nodded. "It certainly is." Then she looked toward one of the servers. "Would someone please bring the dessert wine?" The young waiter hurried away. A few guests resumed quiet conversations. They assumed the speech had ended. Ashley believed the difficult part of the evening was behind her. She couldn't have been more mistaken. Thomas leaned slightly toward me. His voice was barely above a whisper. "She has now represented to investors that all ownership approvals have been secured," I heard. "That statement matters." "I know." He looked at me carefully. "The next decision is yours." I rested my hand over my purse beneath the table. The worn leather felt reassuring. Inside rested the family ledger. Alongside it were copies of the original ownership provisions Thomas had brought into the library. Michael used to tell me that timing mattered almost as much as truth. "The right words at the wrong moment become noise," he'd often say. "But the right words at the right moment," he would smile, "they change everything." Across the room, Ashley laughed at something Richard had said. She looked relaxed, victorious, completely certain she had impressed everyone. Ryan finally looked toward me. For the first time all evening, our eyes met without interruption. His expression wasn't angry. It wasn't defensive. It was frightened. He knew. Somewhere deep inside, he knew exactly what was about to happen. I didn't glare at him. I didn't shake my head. I simply held his gaze. Then I slowly reached down, opened my purse, and wrapped my fingers around the familiar leather cover of the family ledger. Ryan's face lost its color. He remembered that book. Of course he did. He had watched me write in it throughout his childhood. He knew what it contained. More importantly, he knew what it proved. Ashley was thanking everyone once again, preparing to invite the guests to dinner. She never noticed Ryan staring at me. She never noticed my hand disappear into my purse. She never noticed Thomas quietly standing beside his chair. The room was still smiling, still celebrating, still believing the polished story they had been told. In only a few moments, that story would meet the one that had been written in ink over nearly 50 years. And unlike polished speeches, the ledger had never forgotten a single name. For a few seconds, I remained seated. Not because I was uncertain, because I wanted to be absolutely certain that when I stood, I would do so for the right reason. Not revenge, not humiliation. Truth. Ashley smiled toward the guests one last time. "Please enjoy dinner. We'll complete the investment documents afterward." She reached for her glass. That was my moment. I stood. My chair slid back with a soft scrape against the hardwood floor. It wasn't loud, yet somehow it drew every eye in the room. Ashley looked at me with polite confusion. "Jenny," I smiled gently. "If you don't mind," I said, my voice calm and steady, "I'd like to say a few words before everyone enjoys dinner." For a heartbeat, the room was completely silent. Ashley laughed lightly. "Oh, Jenny, perhaps after dinner." "I won't be long." Her smile stiffened. "I'm afraid we're already running behind schedule." Thomas Caldwell slowly rose from his chair. "I believe Mrs. Just has earned a few minutes." Several guests turned toward him. Richard Hayes looked curious. "Mr. Caldwell." Thomas nodded respectfully. "I've represented the Just family for over 40 years. He looked around the room before continuing. "If Mrs. Just wishes to speak, I think everyone here would benefit from listening." Ashley blinked. She hadn't expected that. She recovered quickly. "Of course," she said, though the warmth had disappeared from her voice. "If it'll only take a minute." "It may take a little longer than that," I replied softly. I reached into my purse. The worn leather cover of the family ledger appeared in my hands. A few guests exchanged puzzled glances. Ashley frowned. "What is that?" I rested the book carefully on the table in front of me. "This," I said gently, brushing my fingertips across its cover, "is the history of the Just family." Ashley forced a smile. "I'm sure it's a lovely keepsake." "It is." I looked around the room. "But it is much more than that." Richard leaned forward with interest. The room had become so quiet that I could hear the candles flickering. "I'd like to introduce myself properly," I began. "My name is Jenny Just." I paused. "I am Michael Just's widow." Several people nodded politely. "I am Ryan Just's mother." The silence deepened. "I am also the woman who helped build the company everyone is celebrating tonight." A ripple moved through the room. I noticed Linda Morrison quietly lower her eyes. Grace smiled through tears. Ryan stared at the table. Ashley spoke quickly. "Well, yes, of course, Jenny has always been—" I raised one hand gently. Not to silence her, simply to ask for my turn. She stopped speaking. "I've listened all evening," I said. "I think it's fair if everyone listens for just a few minutes now." No one objected. I slowly opened the ledger. The pages crackled softly. 47 years ago, my husband and I opened a small hardware store. I turned to the first page. This book records every loan we took. Another page. Every payment we made. Another. Every employee we hired. Another. Every mortgage we risked. Another. And every sacrifice we chose so our son could have opportunities we never had. No one moved. I wasn't giving a speech. I was simply telling the truth. I worked the register. I balanced every account. I prepared every tax filing. I negotiated with suppliers. I sold my wedding bracelet to cover payroll. A woman near the center of the table quietly covered her mouth. Richard Hayes hadn't taken his eyes off the ledger once. I continued. My husband handled customers. I handled the books. We built the company together. I smiled faintly. He always joked that if I ever stopped balancing the numbers, we'd both be living in a tent. A few guests laughed softly. The tension eased for just a moment. Then I turned another page. This entry records the purchase of the land where this house now stands. I gently tapped the paper. At the time, it wasn't a mansion. It was an empty field. I looked toward the windows. My husband dreamed that one day our grandchildren would play here. Grace quietly wiped away another tear. Ryan finally looked up. His eyes were red. Ashley crossed her arms. "Jenny!" Her tone carried warning now. I met her eyes. "I'm almost finished." She remained standing. So did I. I turned another page. This section contains copies of our original ownership agreements. Ashley's face changed. Only slightly. But I saw it. She recognized the documents. Thomas stepped forward. "If I may?" I nodded. He addressed the room. "My name is Thomas Caldwell. I served as legal counsel to Michael and Jenny just for decades." He rested one hand lightly on the ledger. "I can personally verify that these records correspond with the original legal documents maintained in our firm's archives." Richard looked from Thomas to Ashley. "So these aren't simply family notes," Thomas answered immediately. "No. They are supported by executed legal agreements." Ashley spoke quickly. "Of course they are." She laughed nervously. "No one is questioning Jenny's contribution." I looked at her calmly. "Actually," I paused. "Someone did." The room became still again. I wasn't angry. I wasn't accusing. I was simply reminding everyone what had happened. "This evening," I said quietly, "many of you believed I worked for the catering company." Several guests looked embarrassed. One gentleman slowly lowered his eyes. A woman whispered, "Oh my goodness." Richard frowned. I was under that impression myself. I smiled kindly. I don't blame any of you. You believed what you were shown. No one spoke. I continued. No one introduced me as Ryan's mother. No one introduced me as Michael's widow. No one introduced me as one of the company's founders. I looked toward Ashley. So naturally, I shrugged gently. Everyone reached the only conclusion available. Ashley's confidence was disappearing. Jenny, this is becoming unnecessarily dramatic. I shook my head. I don't think truth is dramatic. I rested one hand on the ledger. I think forgetting truth is. Ryan suddenly pushed back his chair. The sound echoed across the room. Every face turned toward him. For several seconds, he simply stood there. Then he looked directly at me. His voice was barely above a whisper. Mom. It was the first time all evening he had called me that. Not Jenny. Not silence. Mom. His shoulders sagged. I'm sorry. No excuses, no explanations, just 2 words. They hung in the room with a weight no investor presentation could ever match. Ashley stared at him in disbelief. Ryan! But he didn't look at her. He kept looking at me. I should have stopped it the moment it happened. He swallowed hard. I knew people thought you were staff. Another painful silence. And I said nothing. A tear rolled down Grace's cheek. Linda quietly reached for a tissue. Richard Hayes slowly removed his glasses. No one cared about expansion plans anymore. No one cared about investment portfolios. The only thing that mattered in that magnificent dining room was a son finally admitting the truth his mother had carried alone all evening. No one moved. No one reached for a glass. The elegant dinner Ashley had planned so carefully no longer existed. The crystal chandeliers still glowed overhead. The candles still flickered down the center of the table, and the catered meal remained untouched, but the atmosphere had completely changed. Ryan was still standing. His eyes never left mine. I'm sorry. He repeated, his voice stronger this time. Not just for tonight, for all of it. Ashley stared at him as if she didn't recognize the man beside her. Ryan, she said quietly, sit down. We can talk about this later. He didn't move. No. The single word surprised everyone. It surprised me most of all. Ashley forced a nervous laugh. You're letting emotions get the better of you. No, Ryan replied. I'm finally letting myself see what I've ignored. A heavy silence settled over the room. Richard Hayes leaned back in his chair, folding his hands together. I think, he said calmly, before we discuss any investment, we should understand exactly what Mrs. Just has shown us. Thomas nodded. I agree. Ashley looked from one face to another. Surely we're not going to derail the entire evening over an old bookkeeping journal. Thomas answered immediately. It is not merely a bookkeeping journal. He walked to my side and carefully opened the ledger to the section we had reviewed in the library. This volume contains contemporaneous business records that correspond to the original legal documentation maintained by my office. He turned a few pages. Mrs. Just, would you mind? I stepped closer. My hands were steady now. For years, these pages had represented memories. Tonight, they represented facts. I opened to the section marked Property and Capital Contributions. The first significant asset our company ever owned, I said, wasn't purchased with company money. I pointed to a handwritten entry dated April 18, 1987. It was secured with property that belonged to me before the company could afford it. Several guests leaned forward. I removed a folded document tucked inside the protective sleeve. This is the collateral agreement. Thomas accepted it and held it carefully. My office drafted this document. He looked toward Richard. The collateral securing the loan came entirely from Mrs. Just's inherited property. Richard studied the document without speaking. Ashley crossed her arms. That was decades ago. Yes, I answered. It was. And without it, Thomas added, there would have been no warehouse expansion. Richard looked up. The warehouse that supplied the company's regional growth. Thomas nodded. The very same. The realization slowly spread across the room. The company everyone admired had not simply grown through good fortune. It had survived because of decisions made long before Ashley entered the family. I turned another page. This entry records the second mortgage Michael and I took after a difficult winter. Another page. This one records the month we paid every employee before paying ourselves. Another. This page explains why I sold my wedding bracelet. A woman seated across from Linda quietly whispered, "My goodness." I smiled gently. I'm not sharing these things to ask for sympathy. I looked around the room. I'm sharing them because history deserves accuracy. Richard nodded slowly. I appreciate that. Ashley suddenly stepped forward. Jenny, no one is denying you helped build the company. I looked at her. Helped? She hesitated. Yes. I gently shook my head. No. My voice remained calm. I didn't help build it. I let the words settle before continuing. I built it with Michael. The room fell silent again. There was no arrogance in my voice, only certainty. Ryan lowered his head. I know, he whispered. Ashley looked at him in disbelief. You can't possibly be serious. Ryan finally turned toward her. I am. You've always known your mother worked in the business. I knew she worked. His voice cracked. I don't think I ever truly understood how much. He looked at me again. When I was little. A faint smile crossed his face through the tears. I used to think Dad ran everything. I smiled sadly. So did most people. He laughed quietly despite himself. I remember waking up at night and seeing light under the office door. He looked down at the ledger. That was you. I nodded. Usually around tax season. You'd still be working. There was always something that needed balancing. Ryan covered his face briefly. I never thanked you. You were a child. I should have thanked you as an adult. Ashley interrupted again. This isn't about gratitude. She looked toward Richard. This is about the future. Richard remained seated. I disagree. Every eye turned toward him. He spoke slowly, choosing each word with care. I've invested in family businesses for over 30 years. He looked first at me, then at Ryan. The strongest companies are built on trust. His eyes settled on Ashley. And trust begins with honesty. Ashley straightened. Are you suggesting I lied? Richard answered carefully. I'm suggesting that important context was omitted. Thomas spoke before Ashley could respond. Earlier this evening, Mrs. Just was introduced to multiple guests as someone assisting the staff. Ashley's face flushed. I never actually said she worked here. Linda Morrison quietly raised her hand. I'm afraid you did imply exactly that. Ashley looked toward her. Linda, I was standing beside you. Linda's voice remained gentle but firm. You never introduced Jenny as family. Several other guests exchanged uncomfortable glances. One gentleman near the end of the table cleared his throat. I believed Mrs. Just was part of the catering team. So did I, another admitted. And I, said a woman beside Richard. No one sounded angry, only embarrassed. Ashley looked around the room as though searching for someone to defend her. No one did. Grace finally stood. Her voice trembled, but she spoke clearly. My grandma taught me that when you make a mistake, you tell the truth before someone else has to. Every adult in the room looked at her. She turned toward Ashley. I think that's what Grandpa Michael would have wanted. Ashley's shoulders sagged. For the first time that evening, she seemed smaller, not defeated, simply unable to control the room any longer. I gently closed the ledger. The sound of the cover settling echoed softly through the dining room. I didn't come tonight to embarrass anyone. I looked around the table. I came because I wanted to celebrate my son's success. Then I turned to Ryan. I still do. His eyes filled again. But success built on forgotten sacrifices, I continued, becomes fragile. I rested my hand on the worn leather cover. This book isn't valuable because it's old. I smiled. It's valuable because it remembers what people sometimes choose to forget. Richard slowly stood. He buttoned his suit jacket before speaking. I believe, he said, our discussion about investment should wait. Ashley closed her eyes. He continued, not because I doubt this company. He looked directly at me, but because before investing in a business, his gaze shifted to Ryan. I need to know whether the family leading it has finished telling each other the truth." No one argued. No one could. The dinner had become something far more important than a business celebration. It had become the first honest conversation the Just family had shared in years. The silence after Richard Hayes spoke was unlike any silence I had ever experienced. It wasn't awkward. It wasn't angry. It was the sound of a room full of people reconsidering everything they thought they knew. Ashley slowly lowered herself into her chair. For the first time since the evening began, she wasn't smiling. Her carefully composed expression had given way to uncertainty. Ryan remained standing. He looked older than he had an hour earlier, not physically, emotionally. Sometimes the weight of truth adds years to a person's face in a matter of minutes. Finally, he spoke. "Mr. Hayes," Richard looked at him, "I understand if you decide not to invest." Richard folded his hands calmly. "This evening stopped being about investment several minutes ago." Ryan nodded. "I know." He took a slow breath before turning toward every guest at the table. "I owe all of you an apology." No one interrupted. "When my father died, I promised my mother I would protect what my parents built." His voice grew quieter. "I thought protecting it meant growing the company." He looked toward me. "I forgot that protecting a business also means protecting the people who built it." My heart tightened. He wasn't making excuses. He was finally speaking honestly. "I let success become more important than gratitude." He swallowed hard. And somewhere along the way, I stopped seeing what was happening right in front of me. Ashley looked at him in disbelief. "Ryan?" He gently shook his head. "Please." It wasn't harsh. It wasn't cruel. It was simply the first time he had asked her to let him finish. "I watched my mother become a guest in her own home." He looked around the room. "Then tonight—" His eyes filled again. "I watched everyone mistake her for someone who worked here." A painful silence followed. I knew it was happening. His confession landed heavily. "I should have corrected it immediately." He looked directly at me. "I didn't. I chose the easier conversation instead of the right one." I saw several guests quietly nodding. They understood. Most betrayals don't begin with cruelty. They begin with silence. Ashley finally stood. "I think everyone is being unfair." No one answered. She looked around the table. "I never intended to humiliate Jenny." Her voice was defensive now, but not angry. "I simply thought—" She hesitated. "I thought she preferred staying in the background." I met her eyes. "Did you ever ask me—" She blinked. "No." "Did you ever ask whether I wanted to carry trays?" "No." "Did you ever ask whether I wanted to sit beside my own family tonight?" Her lips parted, but no answer came. I wasn't trying to trap her. I genuinely wanted her to hear the questions, because somewhere between intention and action lies responsibility. Ashley looked down. "I suppose I didn't." Thomas spoke gently. "Intent matters." He paused. "But so does impact." Ashley slowly sat back down. For the first time since I had known her, she seemed to have no prepared response. Grace quietly reached across the table and slipped her hand into mine. I squeezed it gently. Richard Hayes cleared his throat. "Mrs. Just—" I looked toward him. "I've invested in many family businesses." He smiled politely. "I've also watched several fail." He glanced toward Ryan. "Very few collapsed because of bad products." Ryan listened carefully. "They collapsed because the next generation believed success began with them." The words settled heavily over the room. Richard continued. "Your parents built credibility." He nodded toward me. "People like me don't invest only because of financial statements." He smiled faintly. "We invest because we trust the character behind those statements." Ryan lowered his eyes. "I understand." "I hope you do." Richard wasn't speaking harshly. He sounded almost fatherly. "Financial mistakes can usually be repaired." He paused. "Broken trust is much more expensive." Across the table, Linda Morrison spoke for the first time since dinner had begun. "I met Jenny before Just Hardware had indoor heating." A few people smiled softly. "We used to bring coffee to each other because neither of us could afford proper lunches." She laughed quietly. I remember watching Michael and Jenny argue over who would take home the last $20. Several guests looked surprised. Linda continued. They weren't arguing about themselves. She smiled at me. They were arguing because each wanted the other to keep it. I laughed through my tears. Michael lost. You always made sure he lost. The room chuckled gently. Linda looked around the table. That's the family I remember. Then she turned toward Ashley. You inherited something extraordinary. Ashley listened without speaking. But somewhere along the way, Linda chose her words carefully. Image became more important than memory. Ashley slowly closed her eyes. I never wanted people to think we were old-fashioned. I answered softly. There is nothing old-fashioned about gratitude. No. There is nothing embarrassing about sacrifice. She nodded faintly. No. And there is nothing small about remembering who carried you before you learned to walk alone. Tears finally slipped down Ashley's cheeks. She quickly wiped them away. I'm sorry. The words were barely audible. I didn't respond immediately, not because I doubted her, because apologies deserve time. After a long silence, I asked quietly, What are you sorry for? Ashley looked genuinely surprised. She searched for an answer. I'm sorry you were hurt. I waited. She understood. That wasn't enough. Another long silence passed. Then she tried again. I'm sorry. Her voice broke. That I cared more about impressing strangers than honoring my own family. No one moved. I'm sorry I slowly pushed you further away because I thought the company looked more modern without reminding people how difficult the beginning had been. She looked directly at me. And her shoulders trembled. I'm sorry that tonight I let people believe you were someone you weren't. The room remained perfectly still. This apology felt different, not polished, not rehearsed, simply honest. Ryan walked around the table until he stood beside me. Then, in front of every guest, he did something I never expected. He knelt beside my chair, just as he used to when he was a little boy, asking forgiveness after breaking a window or losing his bicycle. He looked up at me with tears in his eyes. Mom. He smiled weakly. I've spent years trying to become the man Dad hoped I'd be. He shook his head. I forgot the fastest way to disappoint him was by forgetting you. I reached out instinctively. My hand rested against his cheek, exactly as it had countless times throughout his childhood. You haven't lost me, Ryan. His tears fell freely now. But, I smiled gently, you've lost your way. He nodded. I know. And finding your way back, I glanced toward the family ledger resting on the table, begins with telling the truth. Ryan followed my gaze. Then, before anyone expected it, he carefully picked up the worn leather ledger with both hands. He held it as though it were something priceless, because now he finally understood that it was. Ryan held the family ledger with both hands as though it were made of glass. No one spoke. The worn leather cover, faded by decades of use, somehow commanded more attention than the crystal chandeliers hanging above us. He slowly walked to the head of the table. Then, without a word, he placed the ledger directly beside Ashley's leather portfolio. The contrast was impossible to ignore. One was new, polished, expensive, and elegant. The other was old, worn, and scarred by time. Yet everyone in the room instinctively looked at the older book. Ryan rested one hand on each. This, he said, touching Ashley's portfolio, represents where we hope to go. Then he laid his hand gently on the ledger. And this, his voice softened, is why we ever had the chance to go there. The room remained silent. Richard Hayes stood slowly. May I? Ryan nodded. Richard approached the table and carefully opened the leather portfolio Ashley had prepared. He reviewed the first few pages before looking toward Thomas. These are the preliminary investment agreements. They are, Thomas answered. Richard continued reading. I notice they reference approval by current management. Thomas nodded. They do. Richard looked directly at him. And are those approvals complete? Thomas answered, with complete certainty. No. Ashley closed her eyes. Richard quietly closed the portfolio. I'm glad we had this conversation before anyone signed. He looked around the room. Otherwise, every person here would have been operating under an incorrect assumption. Several investors exchanged uneasy glances. One gentleman finally spoke. I think we'd all like clarification. Thomas stepped forward. That's reasonable. He adjusted his glasses. The original corporate structure includes protective provisions established jointly by Michael and Jenny Just. He looked toward me. Those provisions remain legally enforceable. Ashley looked down at the table. Thomas continued, any transaction involving the original family assets requires Mrs. Just's written approval. A woman near Richard asked quietly, So tonight's announcement, Thomas answered carefully, was premature. No accusation, no raised voice, simply the truth. Richard folded his hands. I appreciate the clarification. Then he surprised everyone. He turned toward me. Mrs. Just. Yes. I owe you an apology as well. I looked at him with surprise. I made assumptions tonight. I smiled gently. You made the assumptions anyone would have made. Perhaps. He paused. But I pride myself on understanding people. He glanced toward the ledger. I should have asked more questions. You asked them now. He smiled. Fortunately. Across the room, one of the other investors stood. My name is Caroline Brooks. She offered me a warm smile. My grandparents owned a small family grocery. I nodded politely. When they retired, she continued, people remembered my grandfather. She smiled sadly. They forgot my grandmother balanced every account for 43 years. A few guests nodded knowingly. Caroline looked around the table. I suspect many of us have similar stories. Another gentleman spoke. My mother kept our ranch alive during the drought. A woman added, my aunt ran my father's construction business after hours without ever putting her name on the sign. Slowly, one voice after another began sharing similar memories. Not dramatic stories, ordinary ones. Women whose work had remained invisible because they never demanded recognition. I listened quietly. The room no longer felt divided. It felt reflective. Ashley listened too. Each story seemed to weigh heavier on her shoulders. Finally, she stood. I need to say something. Everyone looked toward her. She took a long breath. I've spent years trying to prove I deserve to lead this company. No one interrupted. I thought confidence meant always looking successful. She glanced toward me. So I removed reminders of struggle. Her eyes filled with tears. I replaced old photographs. She looked toward Ryan. I changed the company story. Then back to me. And tonight, her voice cracked, I treated the woman who built this family as though she didn't belong in it. Silence. Ashley continued. I told myself I was protecting the company's image. She shook her head slowly. But I was really protecting my own pride. Ryan walked beside her. He didn't take over. He simply stood beside his wife. Ashley looked directly at me. I know saying I'm sorry doesn't erase what I did. No, I answered softly. It doesn't. She nodded. But I hope, another tear escaped, that one day I can earn your trust again. I didn't answer immediately. Forgiveness had never been difficult for me. Trust was different. Trust grows slowly. It cannot be demanded, only earned. Grace suddenly stood from her chair. Can I say something? Everyone smiled. Ryan nodded. Of course. Grace looked first at Ashley, then at me. When Grandpa died, she swallowed. I was little. I smiled gently. You were 6. She nodded. I don't remember everything. She looked toward the ledger. But I remember Grandma always saying families aren't perfect. A few people smiled. She always said, Grace looked directly at Ashley, the important thing is whether people choose each other after they make mistakes. The room grew quiet again. Ashley wiped away another tear. Ryan squeezed her hand. I felt my own eyes becoming wet. Children have a remarkable way of finding the simplest version of the truth. Thomas smiled quietly. I believe Michael would have liked that. So do I. Richard agreed. He looked toward Ryan. Mr. Just. Ryan met his eyes. My investment decision hasn't been canceled. Ashley looked up hopefully. Richard raised one finger. It has been postponed. He smiled kindly. I don't invest in companies during moments of confusion. He glanced around the table. I invest after character has been demonstrated. Ryan nodded. I understand. Richard looked toward me. I believe tonight we've witnessed the beginning of that process. He extended his hand toward Ryan. When your family has finished rebuilding trust, he smiled warmly. Call me. Ryan shook his hand. I will. Richard then turned toward me. And Mrs. Just. Yes. The next time I visit this home, he smiled. I expect you to greet me as the lady of the house. Soft laughter spread around the room. Even Ashley managed a small smile through her tears. For the first time since arriving that evening, the laughter felt genuine. No performance, no image, just people, real people. And sitting quietly in the center of the dining table between untouched dinner plates and extinguished ambitions, the old family ledger had accomplished something no speech investment proposal or polished presentation ever could. It had reminded everyone that the strongest foundations are never built from appearances. They are built from truth. The guests did not rush toward the exits. That surprised me. I had expected an uncomfortable silence followed by polite excuses about early mornings and long drives home. Instead, people lingered. Conversations became quieter, more personal. Business cards remained tucked inside jackets. No one mentioned investment projections anymore. The evening had become something entirely different. The caterers quietly served dinner at last. For several minutes, all that could be heard was the gentle clink of silverware against china. Ashley barely touched her food. Ryan pushed his plate aside after only a few bites. Grace sat beside me now, despite the carefully arranged seating chart. No one objected. It was the first genuine decision anyone had made all evening. Halfway through dinner, Thomas leaned toward me. Would you care to finish what you started? I looked at him. I thought I already had. He smiled. You told everyone where the company came from. He glanced toward Ryan. You haven't told them where it goes from here. I understood. This wasn't about the past anymore. It was about tomorrow. I slowly stood once more. I promise this will truly be the last time I interrupt dinner. A few guests smiled. Richard Hayes chuckled. I don't think anyone minds anymore. Soft laughter eased the remaining tension. I rested one hand on the family ledger. When Michael and I started our business, I began, we made a promise to each other. I paused. It wasn't that we'd become wealthy. It wasn't that we'd build a large company. It wasn't even that we'd leave money behind. I smiled at the memory. We promised that whatever we built would always serve the family. I looked toward Ryan, not the other way around. The room became quiet again. I've watched too many families spend their lives building businesses, only to let the business destroy the family. I shook my head gently. Michael never wanted that. Ryan lowered his eyes. I know. No, I smiled kindly. I don't think you truly did. He nodded slowly. You're right. I continued. The company was never our greatest achievement. Several guests looked surprised. It wasn't, Richard asked. I smiled. No. Our greatest achievement was raising a son we believed would become an honest man. Ryan covered his mouth with one hand. His eyes filled again. I failed. I immediately shook my head. No, you stumbled. There is a difference. He looked at me. When someone fails, I said softly, they stop trying. You didn't stop trying. You simply forgot what mattered. A tear rolled down his cheek. I'm ashamed. I know. I don't deserve another chance. I walked around the table until I stood beside him. My husband taught me something many years ago. I smiled through my own tears. He said that a person's worst decision should never automatically become their final chapter. Ryan looked at me as if he were hearing his father's voice. I remember him saying that. I'm glad. I placed my hand on his shoulder. Because tonight isn't the end of your story. It's the beginning of your correction. The room remained silent. Ashley suddenly stood. I need to say something too. I nodded. She slowly walked until she stood beside Ryan. Then, to everyone's surprise, she turned toward me. Not toward the guests, not toward Richard, toward me. I'm not asking you to forgive me tonight. Her voice trembled. I haven't earned that. She took another slow breath. But there is something everyone here deserves to know. The room grew still. When I first married Ryan, she looked down. I admired everything this family had accomplished. She smiled sadly, but admiration slowly became insecurity. No one interrupted. I grew up watching people judge families by appearances. She laughed bitterly. So I became obsessed with appearances. She looked around the mansion. The renovations, the branding, the parties, the image. She shook her head. I convinced myself that if everything looked successful, then I would finally feel successful. Her eyes met mine, and the more attention people gave me, the less attention I gave to the people who deserved it. Another silence. I didn't wake up one morning planning to hurt you. She smiled painfully. I just made hundreds of small, selfish choices. She looked toward Grace. Each one seemed harmless. Until tonight. Grace quietly nodded. Ashley continued. I removed photographs because I thought they looked outdated. I changed company stories because I thought they sounded more impressive. I introduced you less and less because... She stopped speaking. The words seemed difficult. Finally, she whispered, because I was afraid people would admire you more than me. No one expected that confession, least of all me. Ashley laughed quietly through her tears. It sounds ridiculous saying it out loud. No, I answered gently. It sounds honest. She closed her eyes. I spent years competing with a woman who never entered the competition. I smiled sadly. I never wanted your place. I know that now. She looked around the room. I wanted to become part of this family. Her voice broke. But instead, I slowly pushed the family away. Ryan reached for her hand. She accepted it. For the first time all evening, they stood together not as polished hosts, but as two imperfect people facing the consequences of their choices. Thomas quietly cleared his throat. I believe, he said, we've reached the point where practical decisions must follow emotional ones. Everyone looked toward him. He smiled politely. The law can protect property. He glanced toward the ledger. It cannot rebuild trust. He turned toward me. Mrs. Just? Yes. What would you like to do? Every face in the room turned toward me. Richard, Linda, Grace, Ryan, Ashley. For years I had imagined this moment differently. I thought if justice ever came, it would feel triumphant. Instead, it felt heavy. Because justice inside a family is rarely about winning. It's about deciding whether love still has room to work. I rested my hand on the family ledger, then I spoke slowly. I will not approve any investment. Ashley lowered her head. Not today. Richard nodded respectfully. I understand. I will also suspend every proposed transfer involving our original family assets. Thomas made a brief note. Very well. Ryan accepted the decision without protest. I deserve that. But, I continued, everyone looked up. I will not destroy what Michael and I spent our lives building. I looked directly at Ryan. You will remain part of this company. His eyes widened, but not as its unquestioned leader. He nodded immediately. I understand. There will be an independent financial audit. Thomas nodded. There will be a full governance review. Another nod. And from this day forward, I smiled gently, every major decision involving this family business will be discussed openly. No secrets, no assumptions, no rewritten history. Ashley quietly whispered, That's fair. I looked at both of them. This isn't punishment. I paused. It's accountability. Then I closed the family ledger. Its familiar leather cover settled beneath my hands with a quiet certainty. For nearly 50 years, it had protected our family's financial history. Now, it had done something even greater. It had given our family its first real chance to become honest again. The mansion felt strangely peaceful after the last guest left. For hours, it had been filled with music, laughter, polished conversations, and carefully rehearsed smiles. Now only silence remained. The catering staff quietly loaded the last serving trays into their vans. Candles burned low along the dining table, their wax pooling beside half-empty glasses. The grand chandelier still glowed overhead, but somehow the house felt warmer than it had all evening. Not because anything had been repaired, because pretending had finally ended. Thomas shook my hand before leaving. "I'll begin preparing the audit first thing Monday morning." I smiled. "Thank you." He looked at Ryan and Ashley. "Remember." They both met his eyes. "The law has done its part." He smiled gently. "The rest belongs to your family." With that, he picked up his coat and walked toward the front door. Richard Hayes followed a few moments later. Before stepping outside, he turned back. "Mrs. Just." "Yes, I've attended hundreds of business dinners." He smiled warmly. "I've never attended one that taught me more." I laughed softly. "I'm not sure that was Ashley's original plan." Richard chuckled. "I suspect not." He looked toward Ryan. "When you're ready." Ryan nodded. "I'll know." Richard extended his hand. "I'll be waiting." Then he disappeared into the cool Ohio night. Linda Morrison hugged me tightly before leaving. "I've missed you." "I've missed you too," she smiled. "Next time we meet—" She looked around the beautiful house. "Let's do it somewhere with less drama." I laughed for the first time that evening without forcing it. "I'd like that." Soon the driveway emptied. The music stopped. Only 4 of us remained inside the house. Ryan, Ashley, Grace, and me. Grace stretched and yawned. "I'm exhausted." Ashley smiled gently. "I'll drive you home." Grace looked toward me. "Can Grandma come too?" I smiled. "Not tonight, sweetheart." She walked over and hugged me tightly. "I love you." "I love you more." She grinned. "Impossible." "It isn't," she laughed. "It is." Ryan smiled faintly as he watched us. For the first time in years, his smile reminded me of the little boy who used to argue over bedtime. After Grace and Ashley left to take her home, Ryan and I remained alone in the kitchen. Neither of us spoke for several minutes. The kitchen had always been my favorite room in the house. Not because it was beautiful, because it had witnessed ordinary life. Birthday cakes, school lunches, late-night coffee, Christmas cookies, homework spread across the island. Michael reading the newspaper every Sunday morning. So many ordinary moments. Those are the memories that become priceless later. Ryan finally broke the silence. "I almost didn't come in here." "Why?" "I wasn't sure you'd want to talk to me." I poured 2 cups of coffee. "Sit down." He obeyed without another word. For a while, we simply held our cups. The steam curled gently between us. Finally, Ryan spoke. "I've been trying to understand when everything changed." I looked at him. "Have you figured it out?" He shook his head. "I thought it happened after Dad died." I waited. "But I don't think that's true anymore." "No. I think—" He searched for the right words. "I think it happened little by little." I smiled sadly. "Most important things do." He nodded. "I stopped asking for your advice." "Yes." "I stopped coming over on Sundays." "Yes." "I let work become an excuse." "Yes." I kept choosing easier conversations. His voice became quieter. And eventually, those choices became who I was. I reached across the table and gently covered his hand with mine. "No." He looked up. "They became habits." I squeezed his hand. "Habits can change." He laughed softly. "You always make things sound possible." "That's because they usually are." He looked around the kitchen. "I haven't sat in this room with you in years." I noticed. He smiled weakly. "I thought I was too busy." "Were you—" He looked down. "No. I was distracted." Another silence settled between us. Comfortable this time. Ryan's eyes drifted toward the old wooden recipe box sitting near the window. "I remember Dad hiding birthday money in there." I laughed. "So do I." I thought I was clever finding it. "You weren't." His eyebrows lifted. "You knew every year." He laughed. "So why didn't you stop me?" "Because watching you pretend you had fooled us was too entertaining." For the first time all evening, Ryan laughed from deep inside. The sound echoed through the quiet kitchen. I haven't laughed like that in a long time. I know. His smile slowly faded. I'm afraid. Of what? That I've damaged things beyond repair. I thought carefully before answering. You've damaged trust. He nodded. But trust isn't glass. He looked at me. It doesn't shatter forever. It grows again. Slowly. He exhaled. I can do slowly. I know. He looked toward the hallway where the family ledger still rested on the dining table. I've been thinking about that book. So have I. I used to think it was just accounting. I smiled. So did you read any of it when you were young? A little. What did you see? Numbers. And now, he looked directly into my eyes. I see love. A tear escaped before I could stop it. Michael would have liked hearing that. Ryan continued quietly. I've been carrying the company for years. I nodded. But you've been carrying the family. The words settled deeply inside me, perhaps deeper than he realized. After another long silence, he reached into his jacket pocket. He removed a small ring of keys. Without saying anything, he placed them on the kitchen table between us. I recognized them immediately. The master keys, the office, the warehouse, the executive suite, the family residence, every important lock connected to the company. I don't deserve these right now. I looked at him. They belong to the family. He gently pushed them toward me. I want you to keep them. I studied the keys for several seconds, then I slowly pushed them back. No. He looked surprised. Why? Because taking them away won't teach you responsibility. I smiled gently. Keeping them while earning back trust will. His eyes filled again. You still believe in me? I believe in the little boy who once fell asleep under the counter in a hardware store. He smiled through tears. The little boy who thought his parents could fix anything. I nodded. He grew into a man. I paused. He just forgot who taught him that. Ryan stood and walked around the table. This time when he hugged me, he didn't do it quickly. He held on the way a son holds his mother after realizing how close he came to losing something that cannot be replaced. I'm coming for Sunday dinner, he whispered. I smiled into his shoulder. You'd better. And the Sunday after that. I'll expect you. And every Sunday after. I laughed softly. Now that sounds like my son. Outside, the first light rain of the evening began tapping gently against the kitchen windows. It reminded me of countless nights when Michael and I had sat in this very room planning the future. Tonight, for the first time in many years, it finally felt like our family had one again. 6 months later, I stood in the lobby of our company headquarters, holding a cup of coffee, watching employees hurry through the front doors with the same sense of purpose I remembered from the earliest days of Just Hardware and Supply. The building looked different now, not because of expensive renovations, because the atmosphere had changed. The first thing visitors noticed wasn't a modern logo or polished marble floors. It was a wall of photographs. Ryan had insisted on putting them there. The original storefront on Maple Avenue, Michael unloading lumber from our first delivery truck, our tiny office with the old metal desk where I spent countless nights balancing the books, a faded picture of baby Ryan asleep in the cardboard box beneath the counter, another of Grace holding a toy hammer while Michael laughed beside her, and in the very center hung a simple bronze plaque. It read, "Every generation builds upon the sacrifices of the one before it. Never forget where your foundation began." Ryan had asked me to approve the wording. I hadn't changed a single word. Monday mornings had become my favorite time to visit the office again, not because I was returning to work, because no one treated me like a visitor anymore. The receptionist smiled the moment I walked in. "Good morning, Mrs. Just." "Good morning, Emma. Mr. Just is waiting for you." I nodded. "Thank you." As I passed through the hallway, several younger employees greeted me. Some knew me only as the company's co-founder. Others knew the story of the family ledger. Many had heard both. What mattered most was that they knew the truth. Ryan had personally gathered every department together 1 week after the party. He stood before the entire company and admitted exactly what had happened. He didn't hide behind carefully chosen language. He didn't blame stress. He didn't blame misunderstanding. He accepted responsibility. "I forgot to honor the people who built this company," he told every employee. "I will never make that mistake again." Some people expected the announcement to damage the company's reputation. Instead, it strengthened it. Customers appreciated honesty. Employees respected accountability. Even longtime suppliers began sharing stories of their own family businesses. Truth, I discovered, has a way of inviting more truth. The independent audit Thomas supervised found no fraud, no missing money, no hidden accounts, only poor governance and dangerous assumptions. Every recommendation was implemented. A family advisory board was created. Major ownership decisions now required written discussion, recorded meetings, and unanimous approval among the appropriate parties. No one person could quietly rewrite history again. Ashley surprised me more than anyone. She stepped away from public relations for several months, not because anyone forced her, because she said she needed to understand the company before trying to represent it. Instead of attending charity galas and networking events, she spent mornings at the original Maple Avenue store. She worked beside longtime employees. She learned inventory. She answered customer questions. She stocked shelves. One afternoon, I stopped by unexpectedly. I found her sweeping the warehouse floor with Mr. Alvarez, who had worked for us for 34 years. She smiled when she saw me. "I'm slower than he is." Mr. Alvarez laughed. "Much slower." Ashley laughed too. "I know." There was no embarrassment in her voice, only humility. That afternoon, she asked if we could have lunch together, just the two of us. We sat at a little diner Michael and I used to visit after supplier meetings. Ashley stirred her soup for several minutes before speaking. "I finally understand something." I waited. I thought leadership meant standing in front. She smiled sadly. "It doesn't." "No. It means remembering who's standing behind you." I reached across the table and gently squeezed her hand. "You're learning." "I hope so." She looked down. "I know I'll never erase what happened." "No. But maybe," she smiled hopefully, "I can write better chapters." I smiled. "That's all any of us can do." Our relationship didn't become perfect overnight. Trust rarely returns with dramatic speeches. It returns through ordinary moments, phone calls, honest conversations, showing up, keeping promises. Ashley started joining me every Thursday afternoon to organize old company records. Sometimes we worked, sometimes we simply talked. Slowly, she stopped trying to impress me, and slowly, I stopped expecting the worst. Grace had changed too. She spent Saturdays learning the business. Not because Ryan required it, because she wanted to know the stories behind every old photograph. She especially loved the family ledger. "Grandma," she asked one afternoon, "will you teach me how to keep records the way you did?" I smiled. "If you promise never to forget that numbers tell human stories." She grinned. "I promise." Every Saturday we sat together in the old conference room. I taught her bookkeeping, Michael's old principles, how to balance accounts, how to read contracts, how to ask difficult questions before signing easy answers. Most importantly, how to remember the people hidden behind every number. One rainy evening, Ryan joined us. He watched Grace writing carefully inside a practice ledger. "Looks familiar," he said. "It should." I answered. He smiled. "I finally understand why Dad loved that book so much." I looked toward the original family ledger resting safely inside a glass display case near the conference room entrance. After the party, Ryan had asked my permission to preserve it there, not as a museum piece, as a reminder. Every employee who entered the room could see it. Beside the display was another small plaque. It simply read, "The Family Ledger, begun in 1979. It recorded more than business. It preserved integrity." Visitors often stopped to read it. Some asked questions. Ryan always answered the same way. "My parents taught me that success without gratitude is failure wearing a nice suit." The first time I heard him say those words, I almost cried. Michael would have smiled. One Sunday evening, our whole family gathered for dinner. No caterers, no investors, no speeches, just roast chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, and Grace's slightly overbaked apple pie. Halfway through dessert, Ryan raised his glass. "I'd like to make one final toast." Ashley smiled beside him. Grace rolled her eyes playfully. "Another speech." Ryan laughed. "A short one." He looked at me. "When I was a little boy, I thought Dad built this family." He smiled softly. "As I grew older, I thought I built our future." He reached across the table and took my hand. "Now I finally understand." He looked around at everyone. "My father built with his hands." He squeezed my fingers gently. "My mother built with her heart." His voice grew quiet. "And both foundations were necessary." No one spoke for several moments, not because we didn't know what to say, because some moments deserve silence. Later that night, after everyone had gone home, I stood alone on the back porch. The old oak tree Michael refused to cut down still stretched its branches across the yard. The same tree he once said would outlive us all. The evening breeze rustled its leaves softly. I smiled toward the stars. "You were right, Michael. Not about everything. Families still stumble. People still make painful mistakes. But he had been right about the most important thing. The strongest legacy is never measured by the size of a company, the value of a home, or the balance of a bank account. It's measured by whether the next generation remembers the truth with enough courage to protect it." I no longer worried about what would happen after I was gone. The family ledger had done its work. Not because it protected our wealth, because it reminded my family that the greatest inheritance we could ever leave behind was honesty, humility, gratitude, and love. Every family has a story that outsiders never see. Behind every successful home, every thriving business, and every proud family name are countless quiet sacrifices that often go unnoticed. The people who work behind the scenes may never ask for recognition, but their love becomes the foundation upon which future generations stand. Respect should never depend on age, appearance, wealth, or position. The people who came before us deserve more than our memories. They deserve our gratitude. When we forget those who carried us through difficult seasons, success begins to lose its meaning. The truth may remain hidden for years, but genuine truth has remarkable patience. It doesn't need anger to defend itself or revenge to prove its value. Sooner or later, honesty finds its voice, and when it does, it has the power not only to reveal mistakes, but also to begin healing them. Forgiveness is one of the hardest gifts we can offer, but forgiveness does not mean pretending nothing happened. Real forgiveness walks hand in hand with accountability. It allows people to rebuild trust through consistent actions rather than empty promises. If this story touched your heart, I'd truly love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever felt overlooked or underestimated by someone you loved? What would you have done in Jenny's place? Please share your story in the comments because your experiences may encourage someone else who needs hope today. If you enjoy heartfelt family stories filled with emotion, justice, and healing, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and join us for the next story.